I'm Ruby, and I'm 26. 3 days ago, my alcoholic father showed up at my door with my drugged-out stepmother, demanding I pay him back for every penny he supposedly spent raising me. He dragged me to the bank, but I had a plan he never saw coming. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever felt abandoned by the people who were supposed to protect you. You'll definitely want to stick around for what happened next. Let me take you back to where this whole nightmare began. I was 10 years old when my mother died from cancer. One day, she was braiding my hair for school, and 3 months later, I was standing in a black dress that was too big, watching them lower her casket into the ground. Dad held my hand that day, and I thought we'd face everything together. I was wrong about a lot of things back then. After the funeral, Dad started drinking. Not just a beer with dinner or wine on weekends. I'm talking about the kind of drinking that turns a parent into a ghost. He'd come home from his job at the car dealership reeking of whiskey, stumble through the front door, and collapse on the couch with a bottle. Some nights he'd cry about Mom. Most nights he just stared at the TV until he passed out. The food ran out first. Our pantry went from Mom's carefully organized shelves of pasta, cereals, and snacks to 3 cans of soup and a box of stale crackers. When I asked Dad for grocery money, he'd mumble something about getting it tomorrow. Tomorrow never came. I learned to eat breakfast and lunch at school like my life depended on it, because it did. The school lunch ladies started giving me extra portions. I think they knew. Then the bills stopped getting paid. The electricity got shut off twice that first year. I did homework by candlelight, telling myself it was romantic, like in the movies. The phone got disconnected. The water almost got turned off, but somehow Dad managed to stumble to the utility office at the last minute. I suspect he sold Mom's jewelry, though he never admitted it. My clothes started falling apart, and Dad never noticed. The knees of my jeans developed holes that kept growing. My shoes had soles that flapped when I walked. Mrs. Patterson from church brought me a bag of donations one Sunday, pretending it was for families in need, but looking directly at me. I wanted to be embarrassed, but I was too grateful. Those secondhand clothes meant I could stop wearing the same 3 outfits every week. School became my sanctuary. Not because I loved learning, though I was a decent student, but because it was warm, there was food, and the adults actually paid attention to me. My teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, started keeping granola bars in her desk. She'd slip me one for later every Friday afternoon. I saved them like treasure. At home, Dad existed in a fog of alcohol and grief. Some mornings, I'd find him passed out in his work clothes on the kitchen floor. I'd put a blanket over him and get myself ready for school. He never asked about my grades, my friends, or how I was handling Mom's death. I was basically raising myself at 10 years old. And the scariest part was how normal it started to feel. The worst moments were when he'd cry and apologize, promising things would get better, that he'd stop drinking, that he'd be the father I deserved. Those promises hurt more than his neglect because they gave me hope. Hope was dangerous when you were living with an alcoholic. I learned that lesson fast. By the time I turned 11, I'd mastered the art of invisibility. I kept my problems to myself, smiled when adults asked how I was doing, and never let anyone see how desperately lonely I felt. I thought Dad just needed time to grieve. I thought eventually he'd remember he had a daughter who needed him, but Dad was drowning, and he'd forgotten how to swim. Looking back now, I realize that's when I started building the walls that would protect me for the next 15 years. I just didn't know the biggest test was still coming. Dad's drinking got worse after he lost his job at the dealership. Apparently, showing up drunk to sell cars isn't good for business. Who would have thought? He lasted almost 2 years after Mom died before his boss finally had enough. I found out when Mrs. Henderson from next door mentioned seeing him stumbling around the neighborhood at noon on a Tuesday. "Shouldn't your daddy be at work?" she asked while I was getting the mail. I just shrugged and went inside. What was I supposed to say? That my father had become a professional drunk? Without his job, Dad's drinking schedule became even more creative. He'd disappear for hours, then show up with grocery store bags that contained more beer than actual food. I got good at making meals out of whatever random ingredients he'd throw in the cart during his hazy shopping trips. Canned corn and crackers became a delicacy in our house. But somehow, Dad always managed to buy his alcohol. Amazing how that worked out. We'd run out of milk, bread, and anything resembling actual nutrition, but there was always a fresh bottle of whiskey on the kitchen counter. His priorities were crystal clear, and I wasn't one of them. That's when the lonely weekends at friends' houses started. I'd invite myself over to Jessica's or Maria's, hoping their parents would feed me dinner and let me stay late. I became an expert at timing these visits around meal times. Their mothers would always insist I eat with them, and I'd accept graciously while internally celebrating another real meal. "Ruby's always so polite," I'd hear them tell each other. If only they knew I was just desperately hungry. The worst part wasn't the neglect, it was watching Dad disappear piece by piece. Sometimes I'd catch glimpses of the man he used to be. He'd see a photo of Mom and his eyes would clear for just a moment, like he was remembering something important. But then he'd reach for the bottle again, and that clarity would vanish. I started working odd jobs around the neighborhood when I was 13. Mrs. Chen paid me to weed her garden. Mr. Williams gave me $5 to wash his car. Nothing major, but enough to buy tampons and deodorant. The basics Dad never thought to provide. I kept the money hidden in an old shoebox under my bed. Even drunk, Dad had a talent for finding cash when he needed another bottle. School remained my refuge, but I was getting tired of making excuses. Why didn't your father sign your permission slip? Where's your parent for the conference? I became a master of forgery by necessity. Dad's signature on school forms became as familiar to me as my own handwriting. My grades stayed decent, mostly because I had nothing else to do. While other kids went home to family dinners and homework help, I went home to silence and whatever educational programming I could find on our basic cable. The Discovery Channel taught me more about life than my father ever did. But the real wake-up call came on my 14th birthday. I woke up expecting something. Not a party, I wasn't delusional, but maybe an acknowledgement that I'd survived another year in his care. Instead, I found Dad passed out in the bathtub, still wearing yesterday's clothes. I made myself pancakes from a mix I'd bought with my lawn mowing money and ate them alone at our kitchen table. The silence felt heavier that day, like the house itself was holding its breath. That's when I realized I'd been waiting for him to come back, for the grief to end, for him to remember he had a daughter. But Dad wasn't coming back. This version of him, the drunk, the ghost, the stranger, this was who he was now. And I was on my own. I blew out a single candle I'd stuck in my pancakes and made a wish. Not for Dad to get better, not for things to go back to how they were before Mom died. I wished for the strength to survive whatever came next. Little did I know, I was going to need every bit of that strength sooner than I thought. When I turned 15, Dad brought home his solution to our problems. Her name was Karen, and she came with a suitcase, an attitude, and absolutely zero interest in being anyone's mother figure. She was maybe 5 years younger than Mom would have been, with bleached blonde hair and a laugh that sounded like a dying seagull. "Ruby, meet Karen," Dad announced one Tuesday evening, like he was introducing a new piece of furniture. "She's going to be staying with us." Karen looked me up and down like she was evaluating livestock. "So you're the kid," she said, lighting a cigarette in our living room. "Steve told me you were pretty self-sufficient." Self-sufficient. That was Dad's way of saying he'd been neglecting me for 5 years. But sure, let's call it self-sufficient. Karen didn't improve our situation. She just made it more complicated. She had her own money from whatever job she claimed to have, and she'd go grocery shopping regularly. The problem was, she seemed to think food was a privilege I had to earn. She'd buy groceries, then organize them in ways that made it clear what I was and wasn't allowed to touch. "Those yogurts are for Steve and me," she'd say, pointing to the refrigerator. "There's peanut butter in the cabinet if you're hungry." She'd cook dinner for herself and Dad, filling the house with smells that made my stomach growl, then act surprised when I appeared in the kitchen. "Oh, I didn't realize you'd be eating with us tonight," she'd say, like I was a dinner guest in my own home. The mental games were exhausting. She'd hide snacks in her bedroom, lock away certain foods, and create this atmosphere where I felt like I was stealing if I took so much as an apple without permission. Meanwhile, Dad was either too drunk to notice or too grateful for Karen's attention to care how she treated me. Karen also brought her own special brand of criticism to our house. According to her, I was ungrateful, lazy, and spoiled. This was rich coming from a woman who'd moved in with a drunk she barely knew, but logic wasn't Karen's strong suit. "When I was your age, I was working full-time and supporting my family," she'd tell me while filing her nails. "You kids today have it too easy." I wanted to point out that I'd been essentially supporting myself since I was 10, but arguing with Karen was like trying to reason with a brick wall, pointless and likely to give you a headache. So I started working more. Mrs. Patterson needed someone to watch her grandson after school. The Johnsons hired me to clean their house on weekends. Mr. Davis paid me to walk his dog every morning before school. I wasn't just earning money, I was earning time away from home, where I didn't have to watch Karen play house with my father while treating me like an unwanted roommate. The money went into my shoebox savings, which I'd moved to a new hiding spot after catching Karen snooping through my room. She claimed she was just tidying up, but I knew better. Trust was not exactly flowing freely in our household. Dad seemed happier with Karen around, which should have made me happy too. But watching him laugh at her jokes and buy her little gifts while barely acknowledging my existence felt like being erased in slow motion. He'd found someone who wanted to drink with him instead of asking him to stop. Someone who didn't remind him of Mom or represent responsibility he wasn't ready to handle. Some nights I'd lie in bed listening to them laughing and talking downstairs, feeling like a stranger in my own home. I'd think about Mom and wonder what she'd think of this woman sleeping in her bed, wearing her jewelry, and treating her daughter like hired help. But I was learning something important about survival. Sometimes you have to wait out the storm instead of fighting it. Karen might control the kitchen and manipulate Dad, but she couldn't touch my determination or my growing independence. Every job I took, every dollar I saved, every skill I learned was building toward something bigger. I just didn't know yet that Karen was about to test exactly how strong I'd become. The breaking point came 6 months after Karen moved in. I'd been saving money for new school shoes. Mine had holes that let in water every time it rained. After 3 months of walking dogs, babysitting, and cleaning houses, I'd finally saved enough to buy a decent pair that might last more than a semester. I kept the money in a small wooden jewelry box I'd found in a thrift store. It wasn't fancy, but it had a little lock, and I hid it under my bed behind some old textbooks. $53 in crumpled bills and coins. It might as well have been a fortune to me. That Thursday afternoon, I came home from school planning to count my money one more time before the weekend shopping trip. But when I reached under my bed, the box was gone. Just gone. I tore my room apart looking for it. Maybe I'd moved it and forgotten. Maybe it had somehow fallen behind the dresser. But deep down, I knew exactly what had happened. And sure enough, when I went downstairs, I found Karen in the living room painting her nails, wearing a brand new jacket that still had tags on it. "Nice jacket," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Thanks. Steve said I deserved something pretty." She didn't even look up from her nails. "Where did you find the money for it?" That's when she finally met my eyes, and I saw something that made my blood run cold. She was enjoying this. "I have no idea what you're talking about, sweetie." "My money, from my jewelry box, $53. Karen's face transformed into this picture of innocent confusion that was so fake it was almost impressive. "Money box? Ruby, honey, I think you might be confused. Steve and I went shopping today, but we used his money. I looked around for Dad, but of course he was nowhere to be found. Probably passed out upstairs or sitting in a bar somewhere, completely oblivious to the fact that his girlfriend was stealing from his daughter." "I know you took it," I said, my voice getting louder despite myself. "That's a very serious accusation." Karen stood up, suddenly all righteous indignation. "I don't appreciate being called a thief in my own home." "This isn't your home," I shot back. "And that was my money. I worked for months to save it." "Prove it," she said with a smirk that made me want to scream. That's when Dad stumbled in through the front door, still wearing his work clothes from the part-time job he'd somehow managed to keep. He took one look at us facing off in the living room and immediately went into damage control mode. "What's going on here?" he asked, but he was looking at me like I was the problem. "Your daughter is accusing me of stealing," Karen said, and I swear she managed to make herself tear up on command. "I was just trying to be nice to her, and she attacks me like this." Dad's face darkened. He turned to me with an expression I'd never seen before, not just disappointment, but actual anger. "Ruby, apologize to Karen right now. She stole my money, Dad. $53 I saved for shoes." "That's enough," he said, his voice carrying that particular slur that meant he'd been drinking. "Karen has been nothing but good to us, and this is how you treat her?" I stared at him in disbelief. This man who'd barely spoken to me in months was now defending the woman who'd stolen from me. "Dad, please, just listen." "No, you listen. You're 16 years old, Ruby. It's time you learned the world doesn't revolve around you." And that's when something inside me snapped. 6 years of neglect, months of Karen's psychological warfare, and now being called selfish for wanting my own money back. It was too much. "You're right," I said, my voice deadly calm. "The world doesn't revolve around me. I learned that when Mom died and you decided alcohol was more important than your daughter. I learned it when I had to raise myself while you grieved. And I'm learning it now, watching you choose your girlfriend over your own child." The silence that followed was deafening. Dad's face went through several emotions: surprise, hurt, and finally settling on rage. "Get out," he said quietly. "What?" I said, "Get out. Pack your things and get out of my house. If you can't show respect to the woman I love, then you don't belong here." Karen didn't even try to hide her satisfaction. She'd won, and we all knew it. Looking back, I realized that moment was a gift, even though it felt like the end of the world. Dad had finally shown me exactly where I stood in his priorities, and Karen had revealed her true nature. The uncertainty was over. Now I knew exactly what I was dealing with. So I went upstairs and started packing, because sometimes the only way forward is through. I packed everything I owned into 3 garbage bags, which tells you pretty much everything about my life at 16. Clothes, some books, the few photos of Mom I'd managed to save, and the remains of my dignity. Dad sat in the living room drinking while Karen watched me carry my entire existence down the stairs. Neither of them said a word. Walking out that front door felt surreal. I'd lived in that house my entire life, and now I was leaving with less than what most people take on a weekend trip. But honestly, the scariest part wasn't being homeless. It was the relief I felt. The constant tension, the walking on eggshells, the feeling like an unwanted guest in my own home. It was finally over. Mrs. Patterson, the church lady who'd given me donated clothes over the years, let me use her phone to call my babysitting client, Mrs. Morrison. I'd been watching her 3 kids after school for 6 months, and she'd always been kind to me. When I explained my situation, without going into too much detail about Dad's drinking or Karen's stealing, she didn't hesitate. "Come over right now," she said. "We'll figure this out." Mrs. Morrison lived in a small house across town with her 3 kids, Emma, 8, Joshua, 6, and baby Sarah. Her husband had left when Sarah was born, and she was working double shifts at the diner to keep them afloat. When I showed up at her door with my garbage bags, she took one look at me and pulled me into a hug. "The guest room is yours," she said simply. "In exchange, you'll watch the kids full-time and help around the house. I can't pay you much more than I was already paying, but you'll have a roof over your head and food in your stomach." It wasn't charity. It was a business arrangement that benefited both of us. She needed reliable childcare, and I needed a place to live. More importantly, she treated me like a person instead of a problem to be solved. Living with the Morrison family was the first time in years that I felt like I was part of something normal. We had dinner together every night. Mrs. Morrison asked about my day and actually listened to the answers. The kids accepted me as part of their routine, and baby Sarah would light up when she saw me in the mornings. I finished my junior year of high school living there, maintaining my grades despite everything that had happened. Mrs. Morrison made sure I had lunch money and school supplies, never making me feel like I owed her anything beyond the childcare we'd agreed on. But the best part was the stability. For the first time since Mom died, I could count on things. Dinner would happen at 6. Someone would notice if I didn't come home. There were rules and expectations, but they made sense and applied to everyone. I didn't hear from Dad at all that year. Not on my birthday, not on Christmas, not when I made honor roll. It hurt, but it also freed me from the exhausting cycle of hope and disappointment that had defined our relationship. He'd made his choice, and I was learning to live with mine. Senior year, I applied to colleges with Mrs. Morrison's help. My grades were good enough for scholarships, and I'd been working steadily for 3 years. I had options, which felt like a miracle considering where I'd started. The local state university offered me a full academic scholarship. It was only 30 minutes away, which meant I could keep living with the Morrisons and helping with the kids while I studied. Mrs. Morrison cried when I showed her the acceptance letter. "I'm so proud of you," she said, and I realized those were words I'd been waiting to hear from a parent figure for most of my life. College was challenging but manageable. I studied business administration, figuring it would give me practical skills for whatever career I chose. I kept babysitting for extra money and to help Mrs. Morrison, who had become like a mother to me in all the ways that mattered. During my sophomore year, I saved enough money to buy a used Honda Civic. It wasn't much to look at, but it was mine, bought with money I'd earned. Having my own transportation felt like the ultimate freedom, the ability to go anywhere, to not depend on anyone else for basic mobility. That car represented everything I'd built for myself: independence, hard work, and the possibility of a future beyond the limitations of my childhood. I'd take long drives sometimes, just because I could, windows down and music up, feeling like I was driving toward something better. By the time I graduated college at 21, I had a degree, work experience, savings, reliable transportation, and most importantly, a clear vision of what I wanted: to build a life completely different from the chaos I'd grown up in. I wanted stability, success, and the security that came from depending on myself. The only question was where to build that life, and I already knew the answer: anywhere but here. After graduation, I started planning my escape from everything that reminded me of my childhood. I'd saved money throughout college, working part-time jobs on top of babysitting for the Morrisons, and I had enough for a fresh start somewhere new. The problem was deciding where to go. That decision got made for me when I heard Dad had been fired from his latest job for showing up drunk. Again, Mrs. Patterson mentioned it at church, along with the fact that he'd been seen stumbling around downtown asking people for money. The mental image of my father panhandling while Karen stood by was enough to convince me I needed to get out of this town before his problems became my problems again. I applied for jobs in hospitals in 3 different cities, all at least 4 hours away. My degree in business administration, plus my experience caring for the Morrison kids, made me a decent candidate for administrative positions in healthcare. When Children's Hospital in Clayton offered me an entry-level position in their patient services department, I didn't hesitate. The hardest part was leaving the Morrisons. "Mrs. Morrison cried, The kids made me promise to visit, and baby Sarah, who wasn't so much a baby anymore at 4 years old, asked if she could come with me. I'd lived with them for 5 years, and they'd given me something I'd never had: a functional family environment. "You'll always have a home here, Mrs. Morrison told me as I loaded my car with everything I owned, which was still pathetically little, but at least it wasn't in garbage bags anymore. "And Ruby, your father's mistakes don't define you. You've proven that." I drove to Clayton on a Sunday morning in late summer, windows down, feeling like I was shedding an old skin. The city was bigger than anything I'd experienced, full of possibilities and people who didn't know my story. I could be anyone I wanted to be. I found a small efficiency apartment in a house with 3 other roommates, all working professionals who kept to themselves but were friendly enough. It was tiny, barely bigger than a hotel room, but it was mine. I had my own key, my own space, and no one asking where I was going or when I'd be back. The job at Children's Hospital was perfect for me. I was good with administrative tasks, excellent with computer systems, and my experience caring for the Morrison kids had taught me how to communicate with families under stress. Within 6 months, I was handling the most difficult cases and earning recognition from my supervisors. But what I loved most was the stability: regular hours, steady pay, health insurance, vacation time, all the things I'd never been able to count on growing up. I started building a savings account, planning for the future, setting goals beyond just surviving day to day. I also discovered I had a talent for organization and problem solving that went beyond basic administrative work. When the hospital implemented a new patient management system, I picked it up faster than anyone else in the department. When families couldn't navigate insurance requirements, I found ways to help them access the care their children needed. My supervisor, Janet, started giving me more complex projects. "You have excellent instincts for this work," she told me during my first annual review. "Have you considered going back to school for healthcare administration?" The idea hadn't occurred to me, but once she mentioned it, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I researched graduate programs, found one that offered evening classes for working professionals, and applied. When I got accepted with partial financial aid, I felt like I was finally building the life I'd dreamed about during all those lonely nights in Dad's house. Balancing work and graduate school was exhausting, but it was the good kind of exhausting, the kind that comes from working toward something meaningful instead of just trying to survive. I was learning about healthcare policy, organizational management, and leadership principles. More importantly, I was proving to myself that I could handle whatever challenges I chose to take on. By my second year in Clayton, I'd been promoted twice and was well into my graduate program. I had a larger apartment, a small group of friends from work, and for the first time in my life, I felt truly independent. I wasn't just surviving, I was thriving. But success has a way of spreading news, and small towns have long memories. I should have known that my newfound stability wouldn't stay secret forever. I should have expected that eventually, my past would come looking for me. I just didn't expect it to show up drunk at my front door with its hand out, demanding payment for a childhood I'd rather forget. By age 24, I was living the life I'd dreamed about during those hungry nights in Dad's house. I had a corner office at Children's Hospital, a master's degree in healthcare administration, and a salary that let me sleep peacefully without counting every dollar. My colleagues respected my work, my patients' families trusted my guidance, and I'd built something real from absolutely nothing. The promotion to patient services director had come with a significant raise and real responsibility. I was overseeing a team of 12 people, implementing new systems that actually helped families navigate the healthcare maze, and for the first time in my life, I felt genuinely proud of what I'd accomplished. My apartment had turned into a real home, not just a place to crash between shifts, but somewhere I actually wanted to spend time. I had furniture that matched, artwork on the walls, and a kitchen stocked with food I'd bought because I wanted it, not because it was the cheapest option available. The best part was the peace. No walking on eggshells, no wondering if someone was going to steal from me, no dramatic confrontations over basic respect, just quiet, stable, predictable peace. I could come home after a long day, pour a glass of wine, and actually relax. It was a luxury I'd never experienced growing up. I'd also started dating someone decent for the first time in my life. Mark was a nurse in the pediatric ICU, and he was everything Dad wasn't. Reliable, sober, and genuinely interested in my thoughts and feelings. We'd been together 8 months, and he'd never once made me question my worth or my sanity. Novel concept, really. But success, I was about to learn, has a way of attracting exactly the kind of attention you don't want. It started innocently enough. Mrs. Morrison called me one evening while I was making dinner, just checking in like she did every few weeks. We'd stayed close even after I moved to Clayton, and she was one of the few people who knew the full story of my childhood. "Ruby, honey," she said, and something in her tone made me turn off the stove. I got a strange call today. A man asking about you, wanting to know where you were working now. My blood went cold. What kind of man? He said he was your father. He seemed, well, he didn't sound good. Slurring his words, asking if I knew how to contact you. I told him I hadn't heard from you in years. I sat down heavily on my couch. After 5 years of silence, Dad was suddenly interested in my whereabouts. This couldn't be good news. Did he say what he wanted? No, but Ruby. Mrs. Morrison hesitated. He knew about your job at the hospital. He mentioned you being some kind of director now. How would he know that? That's when the pieces clicked together. Mrs. Patterson from church, the woman who'd given me donated clothes when I was a kid. She was still friends with Mrs. Morrison, and she had a talent for gossip. If anyone was going to spread news about my success back to my hometown, it would be her. Thanks for the warning, I told Mrs. Morrison, and if he calls again, please don't give him any information. Of course not, but Ruby, be careful. He didn't sound like someone who was just curious about your life. After hanging up, I sat in my apartment feeling like a shadow had fallen across my perfect new life. Why would Dad suddenly want to contact me after years of complete silence? He'd made it clear I wasn't welcome in his world when he chose Karen over his own daughter. What could he possibly want now? The answer, I suspected, had everything to do with money. Word had gotten back to him that his abandoned daughter was doing well for herself, and suddenly Dad remembered he had family. How convenient. I tried to push the worry aside and focus on my normal routine, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. In my experience, when alcoholics suddenly showed interest in your success, it was never because they were proud of you. The phone call came 3 days later, just as I was getting ready for work. Unknown number, but when I answered, I heard a voice I hadn't heard in years. Ruby? Is that you, sweetheart? Dad's voice was exactly as I remembered. Rough, slurred, with that particular tone alcoholics use when they're trying to sound sober and failing miserably. The word sweetheart made my skin crawl. He'd never called me that when I actually needed a father. What do you want, Dad? Is that any way to greet your old man? I've been trying to find you for months. Heard you're doing real well for yourself up there in the big city. What do you want? I repeated. Can't a father just want to see his daughter? Maybe we could get together, catch up. I'm real proud of what you've accomplished. Proud. Right. The man who'd thrown me out at 16 was suddenly proud of me. I could practically smell the manipulation through the phone. I'm busy, Dad. I have a job to get to. That's what I wanted to talk about, actually. This job of yours. Director at a fancy hospital, making good money. You always were the smart one. And there it was. He didn't want to reconcile or make amends. He wanted something, and it involved my job and my money. I'm hanging up now. Ruby, wait. We need to talk. Face to face. It's important. No, we don't. Yes, we do. Because family is family. And there are things we need to discuss. Things about what you owe. What I owe. The audacity of this man was breathtaking. I don't owe you anything, I said, my voice getting dangerously quiet. If anything, you owe me about 10 years of child support and an apology. That's not how I see it, Dad said, and his fake warmth was dropping away to reveal something uglier underneath. I fed you, clothed you, put a roof over your head for 16 years. That wasn't free. I hung up on him. My hands were shaking, and I felt like I was 16 again, being told I was ungrateful for wanting basic necessities like food and safety. But I wasn't 16 anymore. I was 24, financially independent, and strong enough to protect myself from whatever Dad was planning. At least, that's what I told myself as I drove to work, trying to ignore the growing certainty that this phone call was just the beginning. What do you think will happen next? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Dad didn't call again for 2 weeks, and I started to hope maybe he'd given up whatever scheme was brewing in his alcohol-soaked brain. I should have known better. Addicts don't give up when they think there's money involved. They just change tactics. The first sign of trouble came when I got home from work on a Tuesday evening and found my elderly neighbor, Mrs. Chen, waiting by my apartment door looking concerned. Ruby, dear, she said, wringing her hands. There was a man here earlier asking about you. 2 people, actually. They didn't seem right. My stomach dropped. What did they look like? An older man, probably in his 50s, very thin, and a woman with bleached hair. They smelled like alcohol, and the woman seemed, I don't know how to put this politely, unwell, agitated. Dad and Karen, of course, because apparently my life wasn't complete without my childhood trauma literally showing up at my doorstep. What did they want? They said they were your family, visiting from out of town. They asked which apartment was yours, what time you usually came home. I told them I didn't know you well enough to give out that information. Mrs. Chen paused. Was I right to be suspicious? Absolutely. Thank you for not telling them anything. I gave her my best reassuring smile while my mind raced. If they come back, please don't engage with them and call the police if they won't leave. That night, I barely slept, jumping at every sound in the hallway. How had they found my address? More importantly, what were they planning to do with it? I got my answer the next evening when I came home to find them sitting on the steps outside my building. Dad looked worse than I'd imagined. Gaunt, yellowed skin, wearing clothes that hung off his frame like he was playing dress-up in someone else's life. Karen looked like she'd aged 20 years in the 5 I'd been gone, her face hollow and twitchy in a way that screamed drug use. "There's our successful daughter," Dad said, standing up unsteadily. "Don't you look fancy in your business clothes?" I stopped about 10 feet away, every instinct telling me to run. But this was my home, my life, and I wasn't going to let them chase me away from what I'd built. "You need to leave," I said calmly. "Now that's no way to treat family," Karen chimed in, her voice high and brittle. "We came all this way just to see you." I said leave, now. Dad's fake friendliness evaporated. "We're not going anywhere until we get what we came for." "Which is?" "What you owe us," he said, stepping closer. I could smell the alcohol and something else, something chemical and wrong. 16 years of food, shelter, clothes. You think that was free? The sheer insanity of his logic would have been funny if it wasn't so terrifying. This man who'd neglected me, allowed his girlfriend to steal from me, and thrown me out as a teenager was now claiming I owed him money for his pathetic excuse for parenting. "You've gotta be kidding me. Do I look like I'm kidding?" Dad's voice was getting louder, attracting attention from other residents. "You're making good money now, living in a nice place, driving a nice car. Time to pay back the family that made it all possible." The family that made it possible? I couldn't help laughing, even though nothing about this situation was funny. "Dad, you literally threw me out with garbage bags when I was 16. I've made it this far despite you, not because of you." Karen stepped forward, her movements jerky and unpredictable. "You think you're so much better than us now, don't you? With your fancy job and your attitude?" "I think I'm different than you," I corrected. "I work for my money instead of trying to steal it from children." That hit home. Karen's face flushed red, and she started forward before Dad caught her arm. "Here's what's going to happen," Dad said, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "You're going to come with us to the bank right now. You're going to withdraw money, enough to cover what we spent raising you. And you're going to do it with a smile because family takes care of family. And if I refuse?" Dad looked around at the nice building, the expensive cars in the parking lot, the respectable neighborhood I'd worked so hard to afford. "Be a shame if your colleagues at that fancy hospital found out about your family situation, how your own father had to throw you out for being ungrateful and disrespectful. Might make them wonder what kind of person they really hired." The threat hung in the air between us. He was talking about destroying my reputation, my career, everything I'd built. And the worst part was, I could see in his eyes that he meant it. Addiction had stripped away whatever love or paternal instinct he might have once had, leaving behind only desperation and entitlement. Karen was nodding eagerly. "We know where you work. We know your routine. We're not going anywhere until you pay up." I looked at these two people, my father and the woman who'd helped destroy me childhood, and realized something that should have terrified me but actually brought a strange calm. They thought they were dealing with the same scared, powerless teenager they'd kicked out years ago. They had no idea who I'd become. "Fine," I said quietly. "Let's go to the bank." Dad's face broke into a triumphant grin. "Now that's more like it. I knew you'd see reason." Karen clapped her hands together like a child who'd just been promised candy. They had no idea they were about to walk into their own trap. Because while they'd been busy destroying their lives with substances and bad decisions, I'd been learning how to think strategically, how to plan ahead, and most importantly, how to protect myself from exactly this kind of predator. The bank was about to become very interesting. The First National Bank was only 3 blocks from my apartment, but the walk felt like the longest of my life. Dad kept a grip on my elbow, not tight enough to look like force to casual observers, but firm enough to make his point. Karen walked on my other side, muttering under her breath about how I should be grateful they were family and weren't asking for interest. My mind was racing through options. I could scream, make a scene, but that would create exactly the kind of public spectacle Dad was threatening to create at my workplace. I could try to run, but I was wearing heels and a pencil skirt. Not exactly optimal for sprinting away from desperate addicts. But I had something they didn't expect, a plan. Working in healthcare administration had taught me a lot about emergency protocols and safety procedures. More importantly, it had taught me that sometimes the best way to handle a crisis is to appear to comply while actually taking control of the situation. As we approached the bank, I mentally rehearsed what I was about to do. It was risky. If I was wrong about the bank's security protocols, this could go very badly. But if I was right, Dad and Karen were about to get the surprise of their lives. "Remember," Dad hissed as we reached the bank's entrance, "you're here voluntarily to help out your family. Nothing dramatic, nothing stupid. Just a simple withdrawal." "Of course," I said, my voice steady. Family helping family, right? The bank was busy with the usual after-work crowd, which was perfect for what I had in mind. More witnesses, more cameras, more documentation of whatever was about to happen. Dad and Karen followed me to the customer service area, where a young man in a navy suit greeted us professionally. "Good evening, how can I help you today?" "I need to make a large withdrawal," I said clearly. "But first, I need to speak with the manager about some security concerns." The banker's expression shifted slightly. Security concerns? This was it. The moment that would determine whether my plan worked or whether I was about to make everything worse. "Yes," I said, looking directly into his eyes. "I'm being coerced into this transaction. I'm here under duress." The words hung in the air for exactly 2 seconds before everything changed. The banker's professional smile vanished, replaced by immediate alertness. His hand moved toward something under his desk, probably a silent alarm. "I see. Please have a seat right here while I get someone to assist you." Dad's face went from confusion to rage in the time it took him to process what I'd just said. "Ruby, what the hell do you think you're—" "Sir, please keep your voice down," the banker said firmly, no longer the friendly customer service representative. "I need you to remain calm while we sort this out." "Sort what out?" Karen's voice was getting shrill. "She's just withdrawing her own money to help her family. There's nothing to sort out." But it was too late. I could see movement in my peripheral vision, security guards positioning themselves, other bank employees becoming alert to a potential situation. The bank's emergency protocols had been activated, and Dad and Karen were about to learn exactly what that meant. "Ma'am," the banker said to me quietly, "are you in immediate danger?" "I was threatened and forced to come here against my will," I said clearly, making sure my voice would carry to any recording devices. "These people are trying to coerce me into giving them money." That's when Dad completely lost it. "Coerce?" he shouted, loud enough for the entire bank to hear. "You ungrateful little bitch, I'm your father. After everything I did for you, this is how you repay me?" The security guards started moving closer. Other customers were backing away, sensing trouble. "Sir, I need you to lower your voice and step back from the counter," one of the guards said. "Don't tell me what to do." Dad spun around, his face red with rage. "This is between me and my daughter. She owes me money and she's going to pay it." Karen, apparently deciding this was the perfect time to make things worse, started screaming. "She's trying to humiliate us. We're her family. She has to help us." The beautiful thing about bank security systems is that they're designed for exactly this kind of situation. Every word was being recorded, every threat documented, every unhinged outburst preserved for posterity. Dad and Karen were creating an ironclad case against themselves, and they didn't even realize it. "Ma'am, please come with me," another bank employee said, gently guiding me away from Dad and Karen toward a secure office. "We're going to call the police and make sure you're safe." As I was led away, I could hear Dad's voice getting even louder, more desperate. "Ruby, Ruby, you get back here. You can't do this to family. I made you. Everything you have is because of me." The last thing I saw before the office door closed was Karen lunging toward me, screaming something about respect and gratitude, only to be firmly restrained by 2 security guards. I sat in that quiet office, hands surprisingly steady, and listened to the chaos outside. 5 years ago, this confrontation would have destroyed me. The scared teenager who'd been thrown out with garbage bags would have given them whatever they wanted just to make the screaming stop. But I wasn't that teenager anymore. I was a woman who'd built her own life, earned her own success, and learned to protect herself from people who saw her accomplishments as something they deserved to share. The best part? Dad and Karen had just created enough evidence to ensure they'd never be able to threaten me again. The police arrived within minutes, but the real show was just beginning. Through the glass walls of the office where bank staff had taken me for safety, I could see Dad and Karen in the main lobby, and it was like watching a masterclass in self-destruction. Dad was pacing back and forth, pointing at the office where I sat, his voice loud enough to carry through the soundproofed glass. "That's my daughter in there, my own daughter. I have rights. She can't just abandon her family." Karen had progressed from screaming to what appeared to be a full panic attack, hyperventilating and clutching at her chest. When the paramedics arrived, because apparently someone had called them too, she started babbling about how I was destroying the family and how they just needed help. The bank manager, a composed woman in her 50s, sat across from me taking my statement. "Take your time," she said kindly. "Tell me exactly what happened from the beginning." I explained everything: the phone call, the threats about my workplace, being forced to come to the bank against my will. As I spoke, I watched through the glass as police officers separated Dad and Karen, taking individual statements from witnesses. The entire incident was recorded by our security system, the manager assured me. Multiple cameras, clear audio. If you decide to press charges, you'll have very solid evidence. Press charges. 24 hours ago, that would have seemed impossible. Despite everything Dad had done, despite years of neglect and abandonment, some part of me had still thought of him as family, but watching him rant at police officers about his rights to my money had burned away whatever loyalty I'd been clinging to. A police officer knocked on the office door and introduced himself as Detective Martinez. He was young, probably close to my age, with kind eyes and a professional demeanor that immediately put me at ease. Miss Thompson, I've spoken with the witnesses and reviewed the security footage. What happened here today constitutes attempted coercion and possibly extortion. Are you interested in filing charges? Yes, I said without hesitation. I want them to stay away from me permanently. Based on what I've seen today, I think we can make that happen. The gentleman outside, your father, made several threatening statements on camera. The woman with him became physically aggressive with bank staff. This is more than enough for restraining orders. Through the glass, I could see Dad being placed in handcuffs. He was still talking, still trying to explain to anyone who would listen that this was all a misunderstanding, that he was just a father trying to get help from his successful daughter. Karen was being loaded onto a stretcher, still conscious but apparently having some kind of breakdown. The paramedic was checking her vitals while she rambled about family loyalty and disrespectful children. Will they go to jail? I asked Detective Martinez. Probably not for long, assuming this is their first offense of this type, but they'll be processed and you'll have legal protection going forward. The restraining orders will prohibit them from contacting you or coming within 500 feet of your home or workplace. As I watched my father being led away in handcuffs, I felt something I hadn't expected. Relief. Not sadness, not guilt, just pure relief. The scared little girl inside me who'd been waiting for Daddy to come back and be a real father was finally free to stop waiting. The bank manager handed me a packet of papers. These are copies of all the security footage from today, witness statements, and our incident report. Keep them safe, you'll need them for the legal proceedings. Detective Martinez drove me home while his partner took Dad and Karen to the station for processing. During the ride, he explained what would happen next. Court dates, restraining order hearings, the possibility of Dad and Karen facing actual jail time if they violated the orders. Do you have somewhere safe to stay tonight? He asked as we pulled up to my building. Sometimes family members try to retaliate after something like this. I looked up at my apartment building, my sanctuary, my proof that I'd made it out of the chaos of my childhood. For the first time in years, it didn't feel entirely safe. I'll be fine, I said, but Detective Martinez handed me his card anyway. Call if you need anything. And Miss Thompson? What you did today took courage. A lot of people in your situation would have just given them the money to make them go away. As I watched his patrol car disappear down the street, I realized he was right. A year ago, maybe even 6 months ago, I might have written them a check just to avoid the confrontation. But something had changed in me during this whole ordeal. I wasn't just Ruby the survivor anymore. I was Ruby the woman who'd built something worth protecting. And I'd learned that sometimes protecting what you've built means fighting for it, even when the threat comes from people who should have been protecting you all along. The phone in my apartment was blinking with messages, probably from work, wondering why I hadn't returned after my doctor's appointment. I'd have to explain tomorrow that my personal life had exploded into a law enforcement situation. But tonight, I poured myself a glass of wine, sat on my couch, and let myself feel proud of what I'd accomplished. Not just the career success or the nice apartment, but the strength to stand up for myself when it mattered most. Dad had been right about one thing. Everything I had was because of him. Not because he'd provided or protected or supported me, but because his failures had taught me exactly who I never wanted to become. And for the first time in my life, I was genuinely grateful for that lesson. The restraining orders were approved within 48 hours, which Detective Martinez said was unusually fast. The judge watched the bank security footage, he explained over the phone. Your father's threats were clear, and the woman's behavior was concerning. You're legally protected now. But legal protection and actual safety aren't the same thing, as I learned when I came home from work 2 days later to find my apartment door had been jimmied open. Nothing was stolen. They'd probably been looking for cash or valuables they could quickly grab and sell. But my laptop had been moved, drawers had been rifled through, and someone had gone through my bedroom closet. The violation felt worse than if they'd actually taken something. I called Detective Martinez immediately. This is a clear violation of the restraining order, he said after examining the scene. We'll dust for prints, but I suspect we both know who did this. The question is whether we can prove it. What happens if you can't prove it? Then you should seriously consider relocating somewhere they can't find you. That night, I stayed in a hotel while crime scene technicians processed my apartment. Lying in an unfamiliar bed, staring at unfamiliar ceiling, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible just a week earlier. I was moving, not just to a new apartment, but to somewhere Dad and Karen could never find me, never threaten me, never make me feel unsafe in my own home again. The next morning, I called a realtor and explained what I needed: immediate move-in availability, security features, somewhere I could start fresh without looking over my shoulder constantly. I have the perfect place, she said. Gated community, 24-hour security, controlled access. It's usually out of most people's budget, but you mentioned you're a hospital director. The townhouse in Oakwood Estates was everything I needed and more. 2 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a small yard, and most importantly, a security gate that required both a code and verification from residents before anyone could enter the community. It was expensive, more than double what I'd been paying for my apartment. But watching my father get dragged away in handcuffs had taught me something valuable about priorities. Money in the bank meant nothing if you didn't feel safe enough to enjoy the life it could buy you. I signed the lease that afternoon and hired movers for the weekend. The speed probably seemed crazy to anyone looking from the outside, but I'd learned to trust my instincts about danger. And every instinct I had was screaming that Dad and Karen weren't done with me. Moving day was surreal. Packing up my carefully curated life and transporting it to a place that felt like a fortress was both empowering and sad. I was protecting myself, but I was also admitting that my childhood trauma had followed me into adulthood in ways I'd never expected. Mark helped with the move, though I could see he was struggling to understand the urgency. "Are you sure this isn't an overreaction?" he asked as we loaded boxes into his truck. "I mean, they're in jail, right? They were released on bail," I explained for the 3rd time, "and they broke into my apartment. This isn't an overreaction, it's survival." But I could see in his eyes that he didn't really get it. He'd grown up in a stable family where conflicts were resolved with conversations, not restraining orders and security systems. The gap between our experiences felt wider than it ever had before. The townhouse felt like a sanctuary from the moment I walked through the door. The security guard had checked my ID, called ahead to confirm I was expected, and logged my vehicle information. When I drove through those gates, I felt something I hadn't experienced since childhood: complete physical safety. That first night in my new home, I sat in my empty living room eating takeout Chinese food and marveling at the silence. No footsteps in hallways that didn't belong to me, no wondering if every car door closing outside was someone coming to threaten me, no jumping at unexpected sounds. Detective Martinez called the next day with an update. "The fingerprints matched your father. We have a warrant out for his arrest for violating the restraining order. When we find him, he'll face actual jail time. Any idea where he might be?" His last known address was a motel about 30 miles from your old apartment. "But honestly, Miss Thompson, people like this tend to be transient. He could be anywhere." After hanging up, I realized something that should have bothered me more than it did. I didn't care where Dad was, as long as it was far away from me. The man who'd once been the most important person in my world had become just another threat to be managed and avoided. But moving to Oakwood Estates had done more than provide security. It had given me perspective. For the first time in my adult life, I felt truly settled, truly safe, truly ready to build something permanent. And maybe, just maybe, ready to think about sharing that safety with someone who needed it even more than I had. The idea had been growing in the back of my mind since the day I'd toured the townhouse and seen the 2nd bedroom. It was bigger than I needed for just myself, and I'd spent my entire career working with children and families in crisis. There were so many kids in the system who needed exactly what I'd never had: a stable home with someone who understood what it felt like to be abandoned by the people who were supposed to protect you. The paperwork for becoming a foster parent was extensive, but I had experience navigating bureaucracy, excellent references from my job, and a compelling personal story about overcoming adversity. More importantly, I had something most prospective foster parents didn't: first-hand knowledge of what it felt like to age out of childhood without proper support. As I filled out the applications and scheduled home inspections, I realized Dad had given me one final gift without meaning to. His latest attack on my life had forced me to create the most secure, stable environment I'd ever lived in. And soon, if everything went according to plan, it would become home for a child who needed it as much as I once had. The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was reviewing patient satisfaction surveys in my office. Janet from social services sounded tired and stressed, which wasn't unusual, but there was something different in her voice this time. "Ruby, I have a situation that might be perfect for you, if you're ready for emergency placement." I'd been approved as a foster parent for 3 months, but the right match hadn't come along yet. What's the situation? 7-year-old girl named Sophia. Her parents were in a car accident 2 days ago. Both died at the scene. She's been staying with a neighbor, but that's temporary. No other family members are able to take her. My heart clenched. A 7-year-old who just lost everything, probably confused and terrified about what came next. I remembered that feeling too well. Where is she now? Actually, this is the unusual part. She's still at Children's Hospital where you work. The neighbor brought her in yesterday because she wasn't eating or speaking. The doctors want to keep her for observation, but she really just needs stability and support, not medical intervention. Children's Hospital. This little girl was in my own workplace, going through the worst experience of her life while I sat in meetings about administrative efficiency. I can be ready by tonight, I said without hesitation. Ruby, are you sure? Emergency placements can be challenging. She's traumatized, grieving, and she's never been away from her parents before. This isn't going to be easy. When has any of this been easy? I asked. But that doesn't mean it isn't worth doing. I spent my lunch break going through the foster parent protocols I'd memorized but never used. Emergency placement guidelines, trauma-informed care techniques, age-appropriate grief counseling resources. I wanted to be prepared for anything, but nothing could have prepared me for meeting Sophia. She was tiny for 7, curled up in a hospital bed that made her look even smaller. Dark hair, huge brown eyes that seemed to hold too much sadness for someone so young. When I walked into her room, she looked at me with the same wariness I'd probably shown every adult after Mom died. Hi, Sophia, I said, sitting in the chair next to her bed. My name is Ruby. I work here at the hospital, and I'd like to talk with you about coming to stay at my house for a while. She didn't respond, just studied my face like she was trying to figure out if I was safe or just another adult who would disappoint her. I know this is scary, I continued. When I was 10, my mom died, and I didn't know what was going to happen to me either. It's okay to be afraid. That got a reaction. Sophia's eyes widened slightly, and she whispered, Your mom died too? Yes. And it was the scariest thing that had ever happened to me. But I learned that even when terrible things happen, there are still people who want to help. I'd like to be one of those people for you, if you'll let me. The social worker had warned me that Sophia hadn't spoken much since the accident, but something about shared experience seemed to unlock her voice. Where would I sleep? She asked quietly. I have a whole room just for you, with a window that looks out at a garden and bookshelves where you can put your favorite stories. Can I bring Bunny? She held up a well-worn stuffed rabbit that had clearly been her companion through this ordeal. Of course. Bunny is welcome too. That evening, I brought Sophia home to Oakwood Estates. She was quiet during the drive, clutching Bunny and staring out the window at the unfamiliar neighborhoods. When we pulled up to the security gate, she asked, Why do they need to know who we are? Because this is a safe place, I explained. Only people who belong here can come in. No one can bother us here. I'd spent the afternoon transforming the spare bedroom into something welcoming for a 7-year-old. Bright bedding, stuffed animals from the hospital gift shop, books appropriate for her age level. It wasn't perfect, but it was warm and clean and safe. Sophia explored the room cautiously, touching everything like she was afraid it might disappear. Is this really mine? For as long as you need it to be, I promised. That first night was rough. Sophia cried herself to sleep, calling for her parents. I sat outside her room listening to her sob, remembering my own grief and wishing I could take away her pain. All I could do was be present, be patient, and be the stable adult presence she needed. But slowly, day by day, we built a routine. Breakfast together before I left for work, daycare with a provider who specialized in children experiencing trauma, quiet evenings at home where we read books or watched movies. I taught her how to use the security system so she'd feel safe. She taught me how to braid Bunny's ears. 3 months later, Sophia's caseworker called with news I'd been expecting, but dreading. Ruby, Sophia's grandmother in Oregon, has been approved to take custody. She'll be moving there next month to live with family. It was the right outcome. Sophia belonged with blood relatives who loved her. But saying goodbye to this little girl who'd brought so much purpose to my life was one of the hardest things I'd ever done. Will you visit me? Sophia asked as we packed her belongings. Whenever you want me to, I promised. And you'll always be my first foster daughter, no matter where you live. After Sophia left, my townhouse felt too quiet, too empty. But I didn't stay sad for long. Within a week, Janet called with another placement, a teenage boy who'd aged out of family foster care and needed somewhere to stay while he finished high school. Then came twin girls whose mother was in rehab. Then a baby whose teenage parents needed support while they figured out their futures. My house became a revolving door of children who needed temporary safety, stability, and someone who understood that broken didn't mean unrepairable. Each placement taught me something new about resilience, about hope, about the difference one stable adult can make in a child's life. I'd thought success meant corner offices and financial security, but real success, I learned, was measured in bedtime stories, homework help, and teaching kids that they deserve to be protected. 5 years after Dad and Karen's pathetic attempt to steal from me, my life looked nothing like what I'd planned, and everything like what I'd needed. The scared little girl who'd raised herself in an alcoholic's house had become the safe adult she'd always wished for. Dad never contacted me again after violating the restraining order. I heard through Mrs. Morrison that he'd been arrested twice more for public intoxication and petty theft. Karen had apparently moved on to another relationship with someone who could support her habits. They'd both faded into the irrelevance they deserved. But their legacy lived on in every child who slept safely in my guest room, every teenager who graduated high school from my address, every baby who took their first steps in my living room. Dad had taught me what abandonment felt like, and I'd use that knowledge to make sure other kids never had to feel that alone. Some people would call that poetic justice. I just called it life coming full circle. If this story resonated with you, make sure to like and subscribe for more stories of people who refuse to let their past define their future. Sometimes the best revenge is building something beautiful from the ashes of what tried to destroy you.